Now it's time for RTB 101, where we discuss practical questions to equip you to share your faith more effectively. And here to help me talk about the early chapters of Genesis is astronomer Dr. Hugh Ross. Welcome back, Hugh.
Thank you.
And always want to kind of start at the beginning on things and want to make it very clear that our position is that the first 11 chapters of Genesis teaches real history. It is
real history,
not
real
mythology.
chronology. Right.
Okay. So when we hear people say that Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 seem like they're two contradictory creation accounts, from the outset, we're taking in the position that these are not contradictory
Correct.
Accounts.
But it does raise a question, why two side-by-side accounts?
And I think that a lot of people wonder that because it does seem like they are two very different accounts. Things seem to be in a different order and different conditions. Like, for example, one of the conditions in the Genesis 1 account is it's giving us the big picture. Mm-hmm. God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis chapter 2, we're mostly just focused on humans in the garden. Does that lead us to two contradictory accounts?
Not at all. I mean, I looked at this when I first read the Bible, and what I noticed is that there's a different chronology in Genesis 1 than there is in Genesis 2. In Genesis 1, you got a chronological story about the events of creation, the physical events of creation, whereas in Genesis 2, the chronology is focused on God assigning responsibility and authority to these human beings that he's just created. And so whereas the responsibility and authority has no chronology in Genesis 1, it does in Genesis 2, whereas the physical events have a chronology in Genesis 1, they don't in Genesis 2. You say, why is there overlap? Well, given that they're side-by-side accounts, you get a really brief summary of the responsibility and authority in Genesis 1, and you get a really brief summary of the physical events in Genesis chapter 2. So just understanding there's two distinct purposes.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit more about the responsibility and authority component in Genesis chapter 2. What do you see happening there? Can you give us some specifics?
Well, you do see a parallel because in Genesis chapter 1, it uses the word create 3 times, implicating that God is bringing into existence something brand new that never existed before. And what God does in Genesis 2 is he step-by-step introduces Adam to those 3 creations that are described in Genesis chapter 1. So he says, first I want you to relate to the physical creation, then the soulish creation. Then he introduces him to a creature like himself, his body, soul, and spirit.
Wow, so you actually see that these are two accounts, but that they're focused on different themes, and so that's why they're different. They have different purposes.
Different purposes, and so Moses is basically telling us about creation from 2 distinct perspectives. Let me tell you about the physical creation. Now let me tell you about the creation from a spiritual perspective.
Now, some people would say that there's evidence that it is from 2 authors, different authors, because Genesis chapter 1, it uses the word God as the creator, Elohim. But when we get to Genesis chapter 2, it's Lord God. There's a different title. So does that tell us that these are 2 different accounts?
Well, I noticed that when I was first looking at Genesis. Okay, so trying to communicate something different about God in Genesis 1 than it is in Genesis 2, and I think it is. Genesis 1 is talking about God, the creator. Uses the word Elohim, the uniplural one. I mean, Genesis 1, you actually have implications of the triune God. It mixes the singular and plural pronouns.
Let us make man in our image.
Exactly.
Okay.
Whereas in Genesis 2, the focus is on authority, hence you get the different name for God. So it makes sense that a single author, Moses, would be using these different names for God. And recent computer analysis basically shows that the old idea that Isaiah was written by 4 authors and the Torah was written by 4 authors, and now the computer analysis is telling us 1 author 4 different times in their life. Just like your writing style and my writing style changes as we age.
Very much.
Probably noticed that.
Yes.
Same thing happens for people like Moses and for Isaiah.
Tell me more about this authority issue. Like, what was it that Adam was supposed to have authority over?
Well, what you see this at the end of Genesis 1, a single sentence. I'm putting you in charge to manage the resources of planet Earth for your benefit and the benefit of all life. That's broken down to great detail in Genesis chapter 2, where God says, okay, I want you to work the garden. I'm giving you authority over the vegetation of the earth, but you're also going to be responsible to manage it. And so he puts them to work. And he says, okay, now I'm going to be giving you authority over these nephesh animals, the soulish animals. But this is your responsibility in working with them. And so that's what he's doing step by step. Here's your authority, but here's also your responsibility.
Very good.
With authority always comes responsibility.
I get it. Okay. So when you have presented this point of view of kind of more of the organic connectedness of Genesis 1 and 2, when you present that to non-Christians or Christians who are skeptical about these chapters being connected, what is their response? Do they find this helpful?
They find it very helpful because they've been hearing stories, not that they've read the text themselves, but they hear people saying that the chronology is different in Genesis 1 than it is in Genesis 2. So simply realizing there's a different chronology being communicated in 1 than there is in 2. And just recognizing, for example, you see in Genesis 2, 5, and 6, there's a highly abbreviated, unordered list. Whereas when you go to Genesis 1, you've got all kinds of textual clues. This is first, this is second, this is third, that's fourth. That's missing with respect to the physical creation in Genesis 2. Just take it as an abbreviated, simple statement about what God did.
Very good. Well, this is very helpful. Hopefully this will help people overcome that obstacle when they run into it with their non-Christian friends. And I do want to encourage you to go check out Hugh's blog. Just search Today's New Reason to Believe on our website at reasons.org. Now let's go to Jeff Swearing. He's talking to visiting scholar Dr. Jim Painter about how we can all be healthier. Let's check it out.